Your perception is a weapon, not a burden. And the day you learn to use it consciously is the day you become truly powerful. Carl Jung spent decades studying individuals with what he called differentiated perception, people who see through social masks instantly, detect lies before they're fully spoken, and feel the unconscious tensions in every room. But here's what terrified Jung. These individuals consistently ended up isolated, exhausted, and unable to maintain normal relationships. Not because they were unstable, but because seeing everything came with a psychological cost no one understood. Today, I'll reveal Jung's 10 signs that you possess this rare ability, and why ignoring these signs doesn't just limit your potential, it destroys your life from the inside out. Jung's clinical practice in Zurich revealed a disturbing pattern. Patient after patient arrived, carrying wounds that looked identical. They apologized for existing. They blamed themselves for others' cruelty. They absorbed everyone else's emotional chaos like psychological shock absorbers. But when Jung asked these patients to describe their relationships, he expected scattered thoughts from damaged minds. What he discovered changed everything he thought he knew about human perception. These individuals hadn't been broken by their experiences. They had been studying them. They kept detailed mental records of every person who had hurt them. They knew their abusers' triggers with surgical precision. They had mapped emotional patterns that escaped everyone else. They just never used this knowledge until something pushed them past their breaking point. Jung wrote that the empath's mind is not a victim's diary. It's a strategist's war room, waiting for activation. The first sign appeared consistently across Jung's cases. These individuals possessed what he called superior intuitive function. They could walk into any room and immediately sense the psychological atmosphere. Who was lying? Who was in emotional pain? Who harbored secret resentments? Jung wrote that the patient displays an extraordinary capacity for perceiving unconscious contents in others, but this faculty appears to cause considerable distress rather than advantage. She couldn't engage in small talk because she saw through every social facade. She couldn't maintain friendships because people felt exposed around her. She couldn't hold employment because her presence disrupted the collective unconscious agreements that keep groups functioning. This wasn't pathology. This was consciousness so advanced it had become socially dangerous. What made this ability so disturbing was its precision. Jung's patients didn't make vague guesses about people's emotional states. They identified specific psychological wounds with surgical accuracy. They could sense when someone's cheerfulness masked depression. They detected the exact moment when a colleague's smile became forced. They felt the shift in room energy when unspoken conflicts emerged. And they carried this awareness constantly, like having a radio that picks up frequencies no one else can hear. The exhaustion came not from feeling too much, but from processing information that everyone else remained blind to. Jung observed that these individuals often questioned their own sanity because their perceptions contradicted the social reality everyone else agreed upon. When you're the only person who senses the tension at a family dinner that everyone insists is pleasant, you start doubting yourself. When you're the only one who notices a friend's marriage is collapsing months before they announce their divorce, you wonder if you're creating problems through negative thinking. But Jung's clinical validation proved otherwise. These perceptions were accurate. They were just early. If you've ever felt like you can read people's real intentions beneath their words, that's not anxiety. That's differentiated perception, trying to protect you. The second sign Jung identified was what modern research calls heightened sensory processing. But Jung understood something more specific. These individuals don't just feel deeply. They process emotional information faster and more accurately than anyone else. Their brains are wired for pattern recognition in human behavior. They see the depression behind forced smiles. They sense the desperation beneath confident presentations. They feel the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agree to ignore. Jung observed that roughly 1% of the population possesses this level of perceptual clarity, and society teaches them to suppress it. Modern neuroscience has started catching up to Jung's observations. Research shows that individuals with heightened perception have increased activity in brain regions responsible for empathy and emotional processing. Their mirror neuron systems fire more intensely when observing others. They literally experience others' emotional states in their own nervous systems. But this isn't the weakness society labels it as. It's a sophisticated data processing system that evolved for specific survival advantages. These individuals served as early warning systems in ancestral groups. They detected threats before they materialized. They sensed group tensions before they exploded into violence. They identified deception before it caused catastrophic damage. In modern society, we've lost appreciation for this function. We call it overthinking or anxiety, when someone senses danger that others don't perceive. But Jung understood that this heightened perception represented consciousness operating at advanced capacity. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. Every time they voiced what they saw, people called them too sensitive or overly emotional. They learned to silence themselves, to doubt their perceptions, to apologize for seeing what others couldn't. But the truth doesn't disappear just because you stop speaking it. It accumulates. And in Jung's cases, it had been accumulating for decades. The suppressed perceptions didn't vanish. They created internal pressure that eventually demanded release. Jung documented how this accumulation led to what he called psychological breakthroughs disguised as breakdowns. The moment when accumulated truth finally overwhelmed social conditioning to stay silent. The third sign is the scapegoat phenomenon. Jung documented how these highly perceptive individuals become targets for what he called shadow projection. When someone's shadow is reflected back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind has 2 choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. Jung's patients experienced this constantly. When they gently suggested someone seemed troubled, that person would explode at them for being negative. When they expressed concern about obvious problems, they'd be accused of manufacturing issues. Jung realized this wasn't coincidence. It was psychological defense. The person who sees clearly gets blamed for creating the problems they're merely observing. This creates what Jung called the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals often become the designated problem in every group they enter. Not because they cause problems, but because they reveal problems that already exist in the collective unconscious. Jung observed this pattern across families, workplaces, and social groups. The gifted individual would notice dysfunction that everyone else was unconsciously invested in ignoring. An alcoholic parent's drinking problem, a manager's incompetence, a friend group's toxic dynamics. And by simply existing with clear perception, they threatened the collective agreement to pretend everything was fine. The scapegoating followed predictable patterns. First, subtle hints that the perceptive individual was too negative or too critical. Then, more direct accusations that they were creating drama where none existed. Finally, systematic exclusion justified by claims that the individual was the source of all group tension. Jung documented cases where entire families turned against the one member who dared to name obvious dysfunction, where workplace teams mobbed the employee who questioned unethical practices, where social circles expelled the friend who noticed what everyone else refused to see. The psychological violence of this process was devastating. But Jung realized something crucial. The scapegoating revealed more about the group's shadow than about the targeted individual. If you've noticed that people consistently blame you for tensions you only observed, you're experiencing this pattern in real time, and the intensity of their reaction tells you how much unconscious content you're reflecting back to them. Sign 4 is what Jung called the unnatural calm. Most people expect gifted individuals to be emotionally chaotic, but Jung discovered the opposite. His patients became eerily calm when they finally integrated their perceptions. They had been playing chess while everyone else thought it was checkers. They possessed complete maps of people's psychological vulnerabilities. They understood manipulation before it was attempted. They could predict behavioral outcomes with startling accuracy. This transformation didn't happen overnight. Jung documented a specific process. First came the recognition phase, where the individual acknowledged their perceptive abilities weren't pathology, but accurate data processing. Then came the testing phase, where they began trusting their perceptions despite social pressure to doubt themselves. Finally came integration, where their superior perception became a natural part of their conscious functioning. At this stage, something remarkable happened. The anxiety that had plagued them for years disappeared, not because they learned to manage anxiety, but because they stopped fighting their own accurate perceptions. The internal conflict between what they saw and what they were told to believe resolved in favor of their direct experience. The danger wasn't that they would use this knowledge destructively. The danger was that they finally stopped doubting themselves. Jung documented how these transformed individuals could no longer be gaslighted. They trusted their perceptions absolutely. They saw emotional games before they were fully formed. They became psychologically invincible. And manipulative people could sense this shift immediately. Like predators avoiding light, toxic individuals unconsciously avoided these awakened empaths. Jung noted that his patients often reported that certain people simply stopped contacting them after their transformation. Not because of any conflict, but because manipulators instinctively recognized they could no longer operate their usual psychological games. The awakened individual's presence alone disrupted manipulation attempts. The fifth sign Jung identified was the problem of superior function. When your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering, you're experiencing what Jung called the curse of consciousness. It cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. This isolation isn't just social, it's existential. These individuals often report feeling like they're living in a different reality from everyone around them. They process information at a level that creates unbridgeable gaps in understanding. But here's what made this discovery so important. Jung realized that this isolation wasn't inevitable. It was the result of trying to fit differentiated perception into normal social frameworks. The solution wasn't to see less. It was to find others who could engage with heightened consciousness without fear. Sign 6 reveals itself through complete immunity to gaslighting. Once someone with differentiated perception learns to trust their observations, reality distortion attempts fail completely. Jung observed that these individuals developed what he called conscious discrimination, the ability to distinguish between their authentic inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external content. They no longer questioned whether they were too sensitive when someone denied obvious manipulation. They no longer wondered if they misunderstood when their perceptions contradicted someone's words. They trusted their sophisticated pattern recognition over others' defensive narratives. This immunity created profound discomfort in people accustomed to controlling perceptions. Suddenly, their usual tactics didn't work. Their gaslighting attempts were seen through instantly. Their emotional manipulation was identified before completion. Jung noted that awakened empaths don't need to announce their power. Others feel it in their bones. The seventh sign is what Jung called participation mystique in its shadow form. These individuals absorbed not merely conscious communications, but the entire unconscious atmosphere of their environment. They became psychological sponges, soaking up everyone else's unlived emotions. Jung observed patients who would enter a room feeling perfectly fine, then leave feeling depressed, anxious, or angry, without any personal reason for these emotional states. They were experiencing what Jung termed psychic contagion. The unconscious emotional content of others was bleeding into their own psychological space without clear boundaries. The danger here was identity dissolution. When you absorb so much external psychological material, you can lose contact with your own authentic personality. Jung called this the most dangerous aspect of heightened perception. The individual becomes so flooded with others' unconscious contents that they cannot distinguish their own inner world from what they're absorbing. He documented cases where patients couldn't identify their own preferences, desires, or authentic emotions. They had spent so long absorbing and adapting to others' psychological states that their own inner voice had been completely drowned out. One patient described it as feeling like a radio receiving dozens of stations simultaneously, unable to tune into her own frequency. This is why solitude becomes necessary, not because gifted individuals dislike people, but because they need time for absorbed material to settle so they can recognize their own authentic voice. Jung prescribed what he called psychological hygiene practices, daily periods of complete solitude where external stimulation was minimized, time in nature where human psychological frequencies were absent, creative expression that allowed the individual to distinguish their authentic content from absorbed material, meditation or contemplative practices that created internal stillness. Through these practices, his patients learned to recognize which emotions belonged to them and which they had absorbed from their environment. They developed what Jung called conscious discrimination, the ability to feel others' emotions without becoming possessed by them. If you feel exhausted after social interactions and need significant alone time to feel like yourself again, this is differentiated perception processing external psychological data. You're not antisocial. You're not weak. You're clearing absorbed psychological material so you can reconnect with your authentic self. Jung emphasized that this need for solitude wasn't pathological withdrawal. It was essential psychological maintenance for individuals operating with heightened perceptual sensitivity. Sign 8 appears as the return to service after integration. Jung documented how his patients, after learning to manage their perceptive abilities consciously, became what he called psychological architects. They used their emotional intelligence strategically. They could read clients' real needs before they were voiced. They identified emotional predators within minutes. They trusted their intuitive intelligence completely. Their decisions became flawless because they weren't clouded by social pressure to doubt clear perception. These individuals built extraordinarily successful lives, not despite their sensitivity, but because they finally honored it properly. They became selectively empathetic, still deeply caring, but strategically protective of where that care flowed. Jung observed that they didn't become less empathetic, they became perfectly empathetic, which meant they were also perfectly strategic about protecting their psychological resources. The 9th sign Jung identified was the compulsion to repeat before integration. These individuals unconsciously recreated the same painful patterns while believing themselves victims of fate. They seemed genuinely surprised each time the pattern repeated, as if they were victims of destiny rather than unconscious architects of their own recurring experience. Jung called this negative synchronicity, the unconscious ability to orchestrate encounters that perpetuate unresolved patterns. The person trapped in repetition compulsions unconsciously emits signals that attract precisely those who can help recreate original traumatic scenarios. The danger is getting recruited into their psychological drama. Without realizing it, You can find yourself playing a role in a story that began long before you met this person. Usually the role of betrayer, abandoner, or persecutor. This pattern only breaks when the individual becomes conscious of their role in creating these repetitions. The 10th and most profound sign is what Jung called the gift of evolutionary perception. He believed that individuals with heightened perception serve an essential function for human consciousness. They see what collective consciousness is not yet ready to acknowledge. They sense psychological patterns that explain collective behavior. They feel environmental and social unsustainability before it becomes obvious. They perceive spiritual possibilities beyond current frameworks. Jung wrote that what appears in the individual first as psychological insight later manifests in the collective as cultural transformation. The individual serves as a laboratory for consciousness experiments that will eventually benefit the whole. These gifted individuals aren't broken. They're psychologically ahead of their time. Their personal symptoms often reflect what entire cultures need to address. But to serve this function effectively, they must first learn integration. Jung's solution was what he called the individuation process, a systematic approach to maintaining individual identity while developing conscious relationship with unconscious contents. The first phase was recognition and differentiation, learning to distinguish between authentic inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external content. Jung instructed patients to spend time in complete solitude daily, allowing absorbed material to settle so they could recognize their own psychological voice. He taught them to ask a crucial question whenever they experienced an emotion. Does this feeling have a clear cause in my recent personal experience, or did it appear after interacting with someone else? This simple question helped his patients begin distinguishing their authentic emotions from absorbed content. The second phase was shadow integration. Jung discovered that people who see others' shadows clearly often do so because they haven't integrated their own. The more you deny your own capacity for manipulation, the more disturbed you'll be by seeing these qualities in others. This created a paradox. The individuals most disgusted by others' darkness were often those most disconnected from their own shadow. Jung taught his patients to approach their shadow with curiosity rather than judgment, to recognize that every human contains the full spectrum of psychological possibilities. Shadow integration means acknowledging that you contain every human quality you observe in others, the capacity for cruelty alongside compassion, the potential for manipulation alongside authenticity, the possibility of selfishness alongside generosity. This doesn't make you bad, it makes you complete. A whole person who can witness the full range of human experience without judgment because you've acknowledged these possibilities within yourself. The third phase was conscious participation, the ability to engage with others' psychological contents without being overwhelmed or losing individual identity. This requires developing what Jung called psychological containers, the ability to hold others' unconscious contents temporarily while maintaining awareness that they are not your own. Jung taught specific techniques for this. Visualization practices where patients imagine themselves surrounded by a permeable but protective boundary, one that allowed them to perceive others' emotional states while maintaining clear awareness of where others ended and they began. Grounding practices that reconnected them with their physical body when they felt lost in others' psychological material. And most importantly, the practice of naming what they were experiencing. When you can say to yourself, I am feeling John's anxiety right now, not my own anxiety, you create psychological distance that prevents absorption. The fourth phase, which Jung added later in his work, was strategic expression. Learning when, how, and with whom to share perceptions. Not every perception needs to be voiced. Not every truth needs to be spoken in every context. Gifted individuals who learn integration develop sophisticated discernment about revelation. They recognize that some people can receive their perceptions as valuable insights. Others will experience them as attacks. The integrated individual learns to read this capacity in others before sharing what they see. They develop what Jung called conscious discretion, the wisdom to know when silence serves better than truth-telling. Jung studied historical figures to understand the difference between successful integration and breakdown. He examined Nietzsche's case as an example of unintegrated perception leading to collapse. Nietzsche possessed extraordinary insight into human nature, but he remained identified with his superior function rather than integrating it. He used his perception as a weapon against society instead of in service of healing. Jung observed that Nietzsche could see through religious hypocrisy, philosophical pretension, and cultural weakness with devastating clarity. But this clarity isolated him completely. He couldn't find peers who could engage with his level of perception. He couldn't translate his insights into forms that would help rather than alienate, and he couldn't integrate his own shadow. He projected all weakness onto others while maintaining an inflated self-image. Jung noted that Nietzsche's writing became increasingly grandiose as his isolation deepened. He began identifying with archetypal forces beyond individual capacity. He called himself the Antichrist, the herald of new epochs, the destroyer of old values. This inflation compensated for profound disconnection from community. Jung observed that Nietzsche's breakdown represented what happens when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual becomes consumed by what they see rather than transformed by it. The perception that should have been a gift became a curse because Nietzsche never learned to hold it with humility. His final collapse into madness was the inevitable result of consciousness that expanded beyond capacity to integrate. In contrast, Jung studied Meister Eckhart as successful integration. Eckhart possessed mystical intuition, but channeled his insights into compassionate service. He could perceive spiritual and psychological realities that escaped ordinary consciousness. He saw through religious formalism to direct experience. He understood paradoxes most minds couldn't hold. He accessed states revealing the constructed nature of everyday reality. But unlike Nietzsche, Eckhart transformed superior perception into wisdom that could nourish without overwhelming. He developed teaching methods meeting people where they were while pointing toward deeper possibilities. He used metaphors making profound truths accessible. He maintained genuine relationships with students, colleagues, and community. Jung noted that Eckhart's success came from conscious humility, the recognition that superior perception is a gift to be shared wisely, not a weapon to be wielded. Eckhart never claimed superiority based on his perceptions. He positioned himself as a servant of truth rather than its master. He acknowledged the limits of language even as he used it skillfully. And most importantly, he maintained his humanity. He didn't inflate into archetypal identifications. He remained a finite human being with access to infinite perception. This balance allowed him to serve as a bridge between ordinary and heightened consciousness. His life demonstrated that superior perception, properly integrated, enriches rather than isolates. Your superior perception isn't a malfunction in your psychological makeup. It's an advanced feature of consciousness development. You're not broken because you see everything others miss. You're psychologically ahead of your time. The question isn't whether you should suppress your perception to fit in with collective unconsciousness. The question is whether you'll develop the individuation skills necessary to integrate your perception consciously. Jung's method offers a path from dangerous isolation to conscious service, from overwhelming perception to integrated wisdom, from psychological curse to evolutionary contribution. You are born to see everything, not to suffer in silence, but to serve consciousness evolution. The world needs your insights delivered with the integration, wisdom, and strategic awareness that transform dangerous perception into cultural medicine. Your gift is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your gift is your burden. Learn to integrate it consciously, and you become exactly what Jung believed highly perceptive individuals were meant to be. Consciousness pioneers preparing humanity for psychological development that is inevitable, but not yet obvious. If you recognize yourself in these 10 signs, you're part of that rare 1% Jung identified as essential for consciousness evolution. Share in the comments which sign resonated most powerfully with your experience. Your journey connects with others walking the same path. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about psychological types that transcend normal limitations. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.